In this video, I will be introducing to you a study on m-commerce usage. As you are probably aware of by now, the usage of m-commerce is becoming more popular, and customers from different parts of the world are using m-commerce to engage in shopping behavior. So I wanted to introduce this sort of state-of-the-art research in terms of how people are using m-commerce for different purposes and what are some of the drivers that influence the usage of m-commerce across different parts of the world, and in particular, developing and developed countries. So the title of this study is Differential Effects of Customers' Regulatory Fit on Trust and Perceived Value, and m-commerce use among developing and developed countries. So as we all do, the usage of m-commerce. Now, what do we mean by m-commerce? Specifically, when we refer to m-commerce, we are referring to the usage of smartphones and tablets to engage in shopping behavior, and in particularly smartphones, because the prevalence of smartphones is widespread, across the globe. Even in developing and emerging countries, the penetration of smartphones to engage in shopping behavior is becoming more popular and more widespread. So an interesting topic that would be of to be of relevance to managers and to companies that are engaging in m-commerce is trying to understand what are some of the factors that influence customers' usage of m-commerce, and in particular, the trust that people have of m-commerce usage and the value, the perceived value that they get out of m-commerce usage. So as you can see in this slide, there are many different reasons for why people, use m-commerce, in their everyday lives. We use m-commerce to check emails, to do shopping, to engage in gaming. A lot of people, do games on their smartphones. To listen to music, and the list can go on and on. So, and for social media, obviously, we use, smartphones to engage in, social media for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so forth. So, the usage of smartphones, as you can see in this slide, is very diverse, and this is applicable to developing countries and to developed countries. So, the core question that we're trying to ask is what may explain the lack of theoretical and practical understanding of m-commerce drivers across different countries around the globe. So we want to, because m-commerce and the usage of smartphones, as we saw in the previous slide, is very widespread, is very popular. Companies are interested in understanding what are some of the drivers that prompt, that motivate customers to engage in using their smartphones to engage in m-commerce behavior across different parts of the world. So that's our focal interest, the question that we want to address in this study. So some of the reasons as to why there is a lack of understanding in terms of why customers in different parts of the world may not use smartphones to engage in m-commerce, more than they should. It could be due to two reasons, and I will explain the two predominant reasons as to why that may be happening. The first is the overemphasis on utilitarian motivations. So I will be explaining this a little bit shortly, in the next slides. But customers may have different motivations as to why they may engage in m-commerce using their smartphones. One could be due to utilitarian reasons. In other words, to search for information. Utilitarian means functional. So one of the key reasons that a lot of us do is to use smartphones to search for relevant and important information. However, that may not be the only reason as to why people may use smartphones to engage in m-commerce activities. The enjoyment or the self-gratification or the emotional fulfillment or just the fun aspect, the sense of thrill and the fun aspect can be another important reason to engage in m-commerce activities. And that has not been addressed as much as it should have. And there has been more emphasis on purely utilitarian motivation at the expense of these fun enjoyment, at what we call hedonic motivations, hedonic. And another reason may be a lot of the studies and the research that have been done to date have been chiefly focused on single studies, single countries for that matter, single countries. So just looking at one country on its own, or at most maybe two countries. So that sort of gives us a narrow focus, a limited scope in understanding the usage of m-commerce across diverse countries. So in this study, they're going to look at 6 different countries as opposed to 1 or 2 countries, which have been the focus of past studies. So the research objective, there are 2 research objectives. And the first one is to explore the role of both utilitarian and hedonic motivations in m-commerce usage across these 6 countries. And these 6 countries are precisely the US, Australia, Pakistan, India, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. So again, the first research objective is to understand that there may be not only utilitarian motivations, but which was the focus of past studies, but there can be hedonic motivations. Hedonic motivations mean the fun aspect, the enjoyment aspect, the feeling aspect, the emotional aspect. This study tries to examine both of these motivations and how they, maybe in some countries one is more important than others and so forth. The second is to investigate the relationships between consumer motivations, the utilitarian and the hedonic motivations that I just mentioned, and regulatory orientations and their effects on customers' perceived value and trust towards m-commerce. So we'll be talking about what regulatory orientations are, but in a nutshell, regulatory orientation means that some people have a promotion-oriented view towards life, whereas other people have a prevention-oriented view towards life. And I will explain that in the next couple of slides when we get to that. But as I said before, these are the 2 broad goals of this study in trying to understand, the 2 motivations, utilitarian and hedonic motivations in m-commerce usage across these 6 different countries, and to understand, these 2 motivations and regulatory orientations, the promotion focus and the prevention focus, and how these 2, are aligned or misaligned, and how that can affect customers' perceived value and trust towards m-commerce across the 6 countries. So let me just briefly, touch upon what do we mean by more specifically hedonic versus utilitarian products. So just as there can be, hedonic and utilitarian motivations, there can be categorically, if you were to, categorize products into 2, take a binary approach, there can be hedonic and there can be utilitarian type of products. So utilitarian type of products are products that solve an issue, a problem that customers may have. So, car tires, I mean, they need to be durable, they need to be safe, antifreeze, or, power tools, or aspirin, medicine. These are all meant to solve a problem that a customer may have, right? Whereas a hedonic product is a product that, delivers fun, that delivers, enjoyment, that tickles the emotion, that, addresses an emotional need that a customer may have. So something like Disney, right? Disneyland. It's a theme park. People that go there to, to experience adrenaline, to have fun. It's a fun experience. Or chocolate. Chocolate is something that is a hedonic product, especially the premium chocolates. or ice cream can be, or a club can be, or a perfume, or cosmetics, or high-end restaurants, or a theater. All of these examples would be hedonic products or services because they address a emotional need that a customer has, whereas a utilitarian product addresses a functional need that a customer may have. So, this is an app, a food ordering app, or it could be a GPS that tells you how to get from point A to point B. And even, for an app like this, there can be, hedonic motivations and utilitarian motivations for as to why customers may want to, use a particular type of app. So, in this example, Foodora is a German food ordering app, just like, Uber Eats or Grubhub or DoorDash is like in the US. And if you compare this app, the way that it's designed, the way that it looks, it's very colorful. It has pictures of food in it. It's very vibrant. It's very, it's very lively. Uses very bright colors. Whereas if you go to the previous, this one here, it doesn't have any of those vibrant colors. It's more of it shows you, more of an informational solution. It uses very, dull colors, very muted colors, whereas the other one, this Foodora, uses very, bright colors. So this, even though they're both food ordering apps, one is more touches upon the hedonic motivation to use the app. The other one, more of a utilitarian motivation to use the app. So the point here is the same app or the same product or the same, service. In this case, a food ordering service using a smartphone can, address a hedonic motivation or can address a utilitarian motivation. Now moving on to regulatory focus or regulatory orientation. Some people are more promotion oriented, whereas other people are more prevention oriented. So I guess a good example that that I think a lot of us students can relate to is, let's say that there's a really hard class. From what I hear, if you are taking, if you're a pre-med major and you want to get into medical school, one of the filtering filler classes that try to weed you out to see if you're really, up to this or not, is organic chemistry, or chem. And I've heard that a lot of students, right, when they're going into OrChem, some students may have the goal, the orientation that I want to get an A in this class. It's going to challenge me. I want to be a doctor. Therefore, I really want to excel in this class. So if you have that type of mindset, that's more of a promotion-oriented, more of a promotion-focused attitude going into that class. Whereas since a lot of them know that this is a weeding class, it's they're trying to weed you out. They may have the mindset that as long as I don't get a C, I'm happy with a B. If I can get a B, I'd be ecstatic. I'd be happy. Why? Because then I'll pass the class and, I can move on to the next step. So here, it's not really promotion. It's not about growth. It's not about really achievement, but it's about avoiding failure. It's about, just trying to get through the class so that you can get to the next step. So if the mindset is that, then that would be more, similar to a prevention focus. That would be a prevention-oriented mindset. So people, consumers, or students may have different, orientations or different focus. Some may have a predominantly, promotion-oriented focus towards life. Others may have a prevention-oriented or prevention-focused, attitude, mindset towards life. So that's individuals. But also, some products are more inherently promotion-oriented or promotion-focused, while other products or services are more prevention-oriented and prevention-focused. So, in this slide, I've given you some examples. So, energy shakes that give you protein, that give you energy, that help you, work out, that makes you healthier. These are more promotion-oriented, promotion-focused products. Or Kaplan, these standardized tests that help you grow and achieve higher scores on, SAT or an ACT or GRE or GMAT. These are promotion focused, promotion oriented services. Whereas, sunscreen, or ADT, which is home protection, to protect you from thieves or burglars from intruding into your home or business. These are prevention focused products and services. Why? Because they're trying to avoid you from getting sunburn. They're trying to avoid you from from theft. So these are more focused on prevention, whereas the other two examples, the milkshakes, the workout shakes, or the standardized test preps, these are more promotion focused. So just as consumers or individuals can be one or the other, same logic can be applied to products and services. Some are just more inherently promotion, whereas others are just more inherently prevention. So having said all of this, let's try to integrate this into an m-commerce setting, and let's try to develop some of these hypotheses that this study tests. So we have two hypotheses in this slide, and I'll read them out to you, and then I'll briefly go over the logic. So H1A states prevention-oriented consumers, when compared with promotion-oriented consumers, are more likely to have a higher level of utilitarian motivation when using m-commerce. Whereas H1B suggests the opposite. It offers the opposite. Promotion-oriented consumers, when compared with prevention-oriented consumers, are more likely to have a higher level of hedonic motivation when using m-commerce. So, as we said before, if you have a prevention-oriented mindset, if you're that type of person, or if you're that type of consumer, then these people will have a more likely to have a higher level of utilitarian motivation as opposed to a hedonic motivation when using m-commerce. Whereas the opposite can be said for promotion-oriented consumers. Because I am trying to achieve something, because I am concerned about growth, these people are more likely to have a hedonic motivation compared to a utilitarian motivation when using m-commerce. So these are the first two set of hypotheses. And then the next two states that utilitarian motivation will have a stronger positive influence on m-commerce perceived value and trust for prevention-oriented than for promotion-oriented consumers. So it's kind of like similar to the previous hypothesis, in the sense that if you have so for prevention-oriented people, the impact of utilitarian motivation compared to hedonic motivation will be stronger on m-commerce perceived value and trust. Whereas H2 says that hedonic motivation will have a stronger influence on perceived m-commerce value and trust for promotion-oriented people than for prevention-oriented people. So it's kind of like matching, it's aligning things up. So depending on whether you are more of a prevention-oriented person or a promotion-oriented person, different types of motivation will have a stronger effect on how they perceive value and trust from m-commerce. So the study, going on to the methods now, so it was a survey using online consumer panels, and a total of 1,183 total responses were collected. And like I said, it was across the 6 countries of Australia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, US, and Vietnam. And the numbers in the parentheses represent the sample size. So they're roughly around 200, close to 200 for each of the 6 countries. So this first result shows you the difference in regulatory focus across the different countries. So as you can see here, if you look at Australia and the US, if you look at the horizontal axis, they have the countries there. And then on the y-axis, they have the level of regulatory focus. So obviously, the higher number represents higher indications for a particular regulatory focus. And the pink line, the dotted line, represents prevention-oriented focus, whereas the blue solid line represents promotion focus, promotion orientation. So as you can see, Australia, the Australians, and the US, the Americans, they have a higher level of promotion focus than prevention focus. So what does that mean? That means that in general, right, in the aggregate, on average, if you cherry pick individuals, obviously there are going to be exceptions. But on the aggregate, Australians and Americans are more promotion oriented as opposed to prevention oriented, right? Whereas the opposite is true for people from Bangladesh and Vietnam. For people from Bangladesh and Vietnam, the people from these two countries, they are more prevention focused, prevention oriented than promotion oriented. Whereas the consumers from Pakistan and India, as you can see, I mean, they're kind of both. They're prevention oriented and promotion oriented. So there isn't one that dominates the other, unlike the other four countries. They're pretty much equal on the two types of regulatory focus and regulatory orientation, which was very interesting to see. So this kind of shows you that, we have to be a little bit cautious here in terms of how to, extrapolate and, to generalize this. But, Australians and the Americans are more individualistic people, which says that individualistic cultures are more promotion oriented. Whereas Bangladesh and Vietnam, these would probably be very collectivist cultures, societies. Therefore, they are more prevention focused as opposed to promotion focused. Whereas India and Pakistan, arguably, I mean, people could argue either way, but they're kind of in the middle. Therefore, they share both prevention focus and promotion focus. So difference in motivation, this slide shows you now the difference in motivation. So again, a very clear pattern emerges here where now we're grouping, Australia and the US as one group, Bangladesh and Vietnam as another group, and then India and Pakistan as a third group. And as you can see from this slide, the Americans and the Australians have a higher level of hedonic motivation compared to utilitarian motivation. Right? Whereas the people from Bangladesh and Vietnam, it's the opposite. Here they have a higher level of utilitarian motivation as opposed to hedonic motivation in using m-commerce. So this, and then for India and Pakistan, they're similar, right? They're both high, they're similar. So this goes to show you that there are different motivations for why people use m-commerce in different parts of the world. For Americans and Australians, the primary reason that dominates as to why they use m-commerce is driven by more hedonic as opposed to utilitarian motivations. Whereas for people from Bangladesh and Vietnam, the primary reason for using m-commerce is driven by utilitarian as opposed to hedonic motivations. And then for India and Pakistan, they're equally important. So you can't emphasize one over the other or de-emphasize one over the other. They're equally important. Okay. So I guess the implication from this slide, which I'll talk about towards the end of this video, is that when you're designing a website or an app, or when you're engaging in marketing communications for an app or a website, you got to push different levers in terms of you got to understand which motivations are more important and which ones are less important for people to engage in m-commerce usage, and that's going to differ depending on the culture, depending on in this case the 6 different countries. So I think that's one important takeaway from this slide. And then this slide shows you the impact of the different motivations. So remember that we're also trying to understand the trust and the trust and the perceived value of using m-commerce. And this slide shows you that so these are like the regression coefficients, right? I mean, we're not going to go into what a regression is because this is beyond the scope of this class, but a regression coefficient is like an impact of one variable on another variable. So here on the y-axis, we have perceived value. And then we have here the impact of the different motivations on perceived value across the different countries. So here again, we see a very clear pattern, which is fairly consistent with the previous slides. So again, for Australia and the US, we see that hedonic motivation has a stronger impact on perceived value of using m-commerce than utilitarian motivation. Whereas the opposite is again true for Bangladesh and Vietnam. For Bangladesh and Vietnam, utilitarian motivation has a stronger impact on perceived value, on m-commerce perceived value, than does hedonic motivation, which is the opposite of Australia and the US. And then for India and Pakistan, we see that, again, they're very similar. They're equal. So both are important. So utilitarian motivation is just as important as hedonic motivation and vice versa in impacting m-commerce perceived value. And then here, this slide shows you trust now. So the previous slide was m-commerce perceived value. Here, it's m-commerce trust, the trust that people have of using m-commerce. And again, it's very similar pattern that we saw with perceived value. Again, Americans and the Australians, the impact of hedonic motivation on m-commerce trust is greater than the impact of utilitarian motivation on m-commerce trust. Whereas the reverse is true for Bangladesh and Vietnam. As you can see there, the impact of utilitarian motivation is stronger than the impact of hedonic motivation on m-commerce trust. Whereas for India and Pakistan, although it's slightly higher here, it's still not as high as Bangladesh and Vietnam. You can see that for India and Pakistan, the pink dotted line is above the blue solid line. So you probably could say that utilitarian motivation is slightly greater than hedonic motivation in impacting m-commerce trust. But again, it's not as significant as it was for Bangladesh and Vietnam. So we can safely, arguably conclude that India and Pakistan, the two motivations, are equally important in impacting m-commerce trust as it was for m-commerce perceived value. So what are some of the, now let's conclude. So what are some of the practical implications and the contributions that we could take away and draw from the findings? So really it boils down to a couple of things. Managers should provide a hedonic shopping experience to consumers in Australia and the US, right? So because as we saw, for the Americans and for the Australians, the hedonic motivation was more important in driving them to use m-commerce. Whereas for people from Vietnam and Bangladesh, it was the opposite. So utilitarian motivation was more important than hedonic motivation. Therefore, a utilitarian shopping experience should be provided to people from Vietnam and Bangladesh. Whereas from India and Pakistan, they were both important. So both hedonic and utilitarian shopping experiences, they're both equally important. So you can't emphasize one at the expense of the other, but you need to, push both levers. You need to provide both experiences. So what this boils down to, again, it really has, implications for, website design, for app design, how you engage in marketing communications, how you advertise these apps, how you advertise the shopping experience in these apps, and what you need to emphasize and de-emphasize to attract consumers and to prompt and motivate consumers from different parts of the world to use the apps. The second broad implication is that managers can predict consumers' motivations if they by understanding their regulatory orientations. So whether they're promotion-oriented or prevention-oriented consumers. So as we saw, Australians and the Americans were more promotion-oriented people, whereas people from Vietnam and Bangladesh were more prevention-oriented people. And then India and people from India and Pakistan were more or less similar. They were both equally important. So, which brings us to the conclusion that promotion-oriented consumers are more likely to activate hedonic motivations when using m-commerce. So if you are again, putting this into context based on our findings, Australians and Americans, because they are more promotion-oriented consumers, they're more likely to seek out and they're more likely to activate, hedonic-driven motivations when they're using m-commerce. So they want to see more hedonic stuff, features, pictures, when using the m-commerce. Whereas prevention-oriented consumers, which were mainly, at least from this study, people from Bangladesh and Vietnam, they would like to see more of a utilitarian motivation, utilitarian features, utilitarian experiences when using m-commerce. So again, these findings have strong and important implications for channel management, because an app or a website is a channel. It's an online channel, right? It's a mobile, moving channel that nowadays a lot of consumers use. And it also has implications for marketing, communications, and advertisements in terms of how they get their message across to consumers, in terms of how they communicate what their app and what their m-commerce platform is about.